Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's great to be back here. Let me just take you all in. I always enjoy that moment of shared silence, the extended moment. As I mentioned, I started as a Quaker, and so it brings me right back to my roots. Your topic this month is demonstration. Generally, this refers to manifestation of something in the outer world or of a healing of some kind. In other words, it's a demonstration of divine law or the results, if you will. But I want to consider demonstration in a different way today by looking at dance as a demonstration of our divinity, as my title suggests. Because sometimes we can focus so much on thoughts that we forget that God can be experienced in our bodies, that we are incarnations of the divine, and that is a joyful thing. To me, dance is one of the ways I express the divine. In fact, just last night, I went out dancing not too far from here, and in a place called the church. Ernest Holmes said, "Healing and demonstration take place as our minds become attuned to the truth of being." And I believe our bodies need to become attuned to the truth of being as well. That we carry an energy in our bodies which attracts or repels energy or just stays in one place. Movement is the nature of the universe, and so I believe dance is a perfect way into the realm of demonstration. Now, as I just mentioned, I was raised Quaker with a kind of spiritual stillness. So I want to be clear, this is not in any way a rejection of that. Stillness is an essential part of the God experience for me. But to fully embody it, I need it to be inclusive of the whole incarnated self, so that the stillness is held inside a fully alive, shimmering body with God energy. This kind of stillness is not frozen and repressed as so much serious religion seems to favor. This stillness is fully alive and vibrant, like what you'll experience on Mount Rainier, or I imagine the Grand Canyon, or certainly on a beautiful starry night. The history of dance and Christianity is an interesting, but sadly, all too often antagonistic one. The earliest Christians reacted to the pagan practices around them in the Roman Empire, with sex slaves and wild debauchery and a lot of abuse. And so they reacted to that in opposition, setting themselves up as something different. We are not that. According to church leaders and early theologians such as Tertullian and St. Augustine, dance incited idolatry, lust, and damnation. Medieval church councils railed against dancing, specifically censuring immoral, effeminate, and mixed dancing. Violators could be excommunicated. One author at the time wrote, this is a quote, "The devil is guide, the middle, and the end of the dance. As many paces as a man maketh in dancing, so many paces doth he make to hell." Yikes. Men of that time saw dancing as one of the evils of women, pointing to Salome's dance as proof. She tempted Herod with her erotic dancing, and John the Baptist died as a result. It's in the Bible, it's a whole thing. But the moral was, see, she did that with her evil dancing. How wicked. And then they added to that the story of Eve to somehow prove that all things feminine are suspect at best, and often mortally sinful and dangerous to the soul. Now, many of these attitudes survived right up to the 20th century and beyond. See Footloose and Dirty Dancing. And down in New York City, dancing was forbidden in bars from 1926 until 2017. 6 years ago. I remember seeing signs warning people not to dance here because you needed a special license for that, and that was over there. And starting to dance once and being told by the manager, please, we'll get in trouble. A certain form of courtly dance flourished during the Renaissance with intricate moves like you might see on Bridgerton. So that one needed to hire an instructor and have time to practice in order to master them. This meant, in other words, that their dancing was refined and not at all vulgar like the lower classes. And this attitude also survives to this day, somewhat, with respect going to classic forms like ballet and eventually modern dance, while so-called street dancing is not to be taken seriously. When there is passion and spontaneity involved, it seems in history that there has often been a dominant narrative of derision. We might ask, why? Why is dance so often banned or restricted? Well, it has often been associated with losing control of one's body and of a wild nature not compatible with good Christian behavior. Many have seen drunkenness and violence then coupled with loud, out-of-control dancing and then connected them. Now, certainly if we get lost in the physical exclusively, it can lead to a kind of nihilistic shallowness and possibly to addictions that harm ourselves and others. But rather than look at the causes of this, we've tried to simply outlaw the effects. Banning dancing or drinking. Consider prohibition in this country. Let's just ban alcohol, that'll solve it. And it didn't. We must also admit, I believe, that sexism, classism, and racism have played a major role in the judgment of and restriction of dance. We are serious and pious, some people seem to say, unlike them. Whether it was people of color, women, or gay men, or any other group people wanted to control or negate. The divine feminine was pushed down in many official church spaces, disempowered in the official hierarchy, so that people had to find that energy elsewhere, often from the Virgin Mary, who held that loving energy, that sense of compassion in a way that people couldn't imagine from a man. And so they wouldn't talk about the compassion of Jesus, that all went to Mary. Because again, they couldn't imagine that in a man. It didn't seem believable. In its rejection of Catholicism, Protestants also rejected what they saw as the cult of Mary. And by refocusing almost exclusively on the text of the Bible and its literal meaning, and by rejecting Catholic rituals, they cut off not only the feminine energy, but you could say the bodily connection in favor of a thought-based, dualistic dominance paradigm. You're good or bad, saved or damned. Compassion, if you think about it, is kind of irrelevant in that narrative. Some of the Catholic elements that Protestants rejected brought spirituality into the body in real ways. Incense, for example. In his book, The Eternal Christ, Father Richard Rohr speaks of the Eucharist as being a bodily event, a true ritual, which takes God into our body through the Christ as Jesus. And he points out that it must have sounded shocking in its time, especially to Jews who saw blood as unclean, not to be touched. But it's a visceral way of getting this Christ energy, one could say, into us. remembering and embodying that reality. He points out that Jesus' first miracle was turning water into wine. Why? To extend a wedding feast, a big party with dancing and, of course, alcohol. Yet, he says, quote, much of later Christianity has been rather prudish and ashamed of the human body, which God took on so happily through Jesus, and then gave away to us so freely in the Eucharist. So our incarnation is to be celebrated, not denied or escaped. But I think because of this history that I'm discussing, we've too often cut ourselves off from our inner lives, those scary impulses and feelings, the passions and the tenderness, the intuition and guidance, the still small voice. We say seeing is believing because we trust only that which can be seen externally. Men especially are trained not to feel, and we are taught to mock things that are not grounded in fact and substance as nonsense. Something outside the 5 senses that we acknowledge: hearing, seeing, touching, smelling, and tasting. Anything else doesn't matter. It doesn't count because we cannot measure it. So where is inner feeling? Where is that sense? Emotions, spirituality, love. Our Puritan ancestors feared sexuality and dancing and anything that got us in touch with our inner selves. Misogyny flourished in this environment. Women burned as witches. This has tragic consequences not just for women, but for gay men, and I would argue, for men in general as well. Limiting what is acceptable to a kind of monotone toughness, where anger is strong, but tenderness and joy are not. As men, it seems we're valued for the physical and for our thoughts. We build things and figure things out. But our inner lives suffer if we are not in touch with that other realm and are taught to avoid it at all costs. Movement has far too often been completely outside the realm of Christianity and Christian expression, especially among the so-called WASPs. Episcopal Bishop John Shelby Spong used to joke that if the Jews were the chosen people, his congregants were the frozen people. Now, certainly in America and elsewhere, Black, African-American churches have in many cases been more comfortable with movement and with passionate singing, and I suppose some of the Pentecostal and other churches have as well. But sexism and racism and homophobia have all contributed in our history to a rejection of dance as beneath us, at least in the dominant popular narrative. I remember growing up with cartoons and comedies that mocked African tribal dancing and Native American dancing. Such dancing was dismissed as primitive, when of course that judgment is what's primitive. As we bring our bodies back into our spiritual expression, as we allow more passion in the music we use, as we do here, we begin to have a spiritual experience in church. This expands its appeal, inviting more of us in and inviting more of each of us into the space. Such a body-positive music and movement-positive take on our spiritual selves finds expression not only in Jesus' first miracle, but really throughout the Bible. The Psalms, after all, were songs to be sung. And there is even joyful, spirit-infused dancing, for example, in the 2nd book of Samuel, chapter 6. King David, who earlier took down Goliath, dressed not in rigid armor, but only in his loincloth, vulnerable, near naked, and yet surprisingly powerful. Think about that. This same David has occasion in 2 Samuel chapter 6 to celebrate. And so he dances, once again scantily clad. Now listen to 2 Samuel 6, verses 20 to 23, as translated with more modern language in The Message. David returned home to bless his family. Michal, Saul's daughter, came out to greet him. How wonderfully the king has distinguished himself today, exposing himself to the eyes of the servants' maids like some burlesque street dancer. David replied to Michal, in God's presence, I'll dance all I want. He chose me over your father and the rest of our family and made me prince over God's people, over Israel. Oh, yes, I'll dance to God's glory more recklessly even than this. And as far as I'm concerned, I'll gladly look like a fool. But among those maids you're so worried about, I'll be honored no end. Michal, Saul's daughter, was barren the rest of her life. Now, to our ears, that sounds pretty harsh. But if we look at that metaphysically, I think what it's saying, perhaps, is that such rejection and judgment cut us off from God. Such rigidity leaves us barren, if you will. The Jewish people, and by extension Christians, descend, therefore, not from the house of Saul, since Saul's daughter was barren, but rather from the house of David, this occasionally ecstatic dancer. We descend not from the one who judged and rejected and mocked dancing, but from the one who embraced it and embodied it and celebrated it. The repression of dance, of movement, of our inner lives cuts us off from a truly profound relationship with the divine and again leaves us barren. Now, I may have shared this story before, I don't remember, but it bears repeating in this context. About 8 years ago, I went on a retreat with other gay men up near Albany. Toward the end of this spiritually centered week, I participated in an exercise of both trust and liberation, dancing in a room with everyone else blindfolded. At the end of the exercise, we remained quiet as we were instructed to remove our blindfolds. Everyone left, and I went out on the porch in the middle of the woods and knew on a visceral level my oneness. It is impossible to capture in words, but more than any other time I can remember, I knew this in and as and beyond my body, and it was profound. It changed me. It lasted for 30, 40 minutes, I don't know, but amazing. Well, that retreat altered me, bringing home the sacred within me, not in spite of, but in connection with being gay. It's a flavor in me that has been an essential element in knowing the God experience. Now, I signed up for seminary shortly after. And before my formal training began, I went to a dating event at a restaurant with a group of gay men, one of whom asked the table, "So what are your spiritual lives like?" And I was not expecting that question. But I had a great answer about everything I'd been doing. And apparently it was the right one. It won the day because the guy who asked that question is my partner of 8 years, Joseph. Not here today, but we are about to get engaged in Paris later this month. I truly believe that somehow that dance changed my life. Got me in touch with something profound within me and within the world that I could not access through thought alone. And that shifted me. And the demonstration has been extraordinary. Living a life I could not literally imagine 8 years ago. Owning and sharing a house, an engagement, joyfully performing at a local theater outside the city, just down the street from me. Living in a village up the Hudson overlooking a lake, on and on. None of that was in my imagination 8 years ago. Dancing has always been an essential part of me. Every time someone has asked me to list 10 joyful activities on a retreat or a class or chaplain training, dancing has been number 1 or 2. As Rumi put it so perfectly back in the 1200s, dancing is not just getting up painlessly like a leaf blown on the wind. Dancing is when you tear your heart out and rise out of your body to hang suspended between the worlds. He also said, "Whosoever knoweth the power of dance dwelleth in God." Whosoever knoweth the power of the dance dwelleth in God. According to Wikipedia, Rumi believed passionately in the use of music, poetry, and dance as a path for reaching God. For Rumi, music helped devotees to focus their whole being on the divine and to do this so intensely that the soul was both destroyed and resurrected. It was from these ideas the practice of whirling dervishes developed into a ritual form. 100 years later, another Sufi poet emerged, one who memorized not only the Quran, but also, they say, the complete works of Rumi. This poet, therefore, was given the nickname Hafiz, which means one who remembers. And so I'd like to close today with a poem by Hafiz, written sometime in the mid-1300s. It beautifully expresses and lifts up the message that I'd love for you to take today. And here is that poem. I know the voice of depression still calls to you. I know those habits that can ruin your life still send out their invitations. But you are with the friend now and look so much stronger. You can stay that way and even bloom. Keep squeezing drops of the sun from your prayers and work and music and from your companion's beautiful laughter. Keep squeezing drops of the sun from the sacred hands and glance of your beloved, and, my dear, from the most insignificant movements of your own holy body. Learn to recognize the counterfeit coins that may buy you just a moment of pleasure, but then drag you for days like a broken man behind a smelly camel. You are with the friend now. Learn what actions of yours delight him, what actions of yours bring freedom and love. Whenever you say God's name, dear pilgrim, my ears wish my head was missing, so they could finally kiss each other and applaud all your nourishing wisdom. Oh, keep squeezing drops of the sun from your prayers and work and music, and from your companion's beautiful laughter, and from the most insignificant movements of your own holy body. Now, sweet one, be wise. Cast all your votes for dancing.